All good? Okay, so good evening, everyone. So welcome to tonight's event, the State of Free Speech at Dartmouth, Creating Visibility, Keeping Score, and Tracking Progress. I'm Jerry Hughes, a class of 1988 and a board member of the Dartmouth Free Speech Alliance. It's a pleasure to have everyone here in person and then those who are joining via live stream. The event is co-sponsored by the Dartmouth Free Speech Alliance, the Dartmouth Dialogues, and Dartmouth Alumni Association, and we want to extend our sincere thanks to all of our co-sponsors for the support and the work facilitating making this event possible. The DFSA is committed to upholding Dartmouth's historic commitment to free expression and open inquiry. Our mission is to promote efforts that build a campus culture that values diverse viewpoints and encourages robust, respectful dialogue. Our work is to create visibility to the situation at Dartmouth and organize support where progress is being made. Tonight, we'll focus on that first goal, creating visibility. Free speech on campus has been a concern for years, and it's only getting hotter and more complex. Many members of the Dartmouth community, as well as the general public and policymakers, are keen to understand what the current climate is, understand what changes are being implemented or considered, and whether the environment is improving or declining. It's difficult to get a sense of the state of things from a distance, which is a challenge that most alumni face, but in many conversations that we've had, we've learned that there are information gaps, even for many who are close to the situation here on campus. So the format for this evening will be a moderated discussion with our panelists, followed by Q&A from the audience here. And for those wishing to ask questions at the end, we'll have a mic. It's a small space, but for the audio for the people who are watching online, that'll be helpful. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. So at the far end, Jennifer Rosales serves as Dartmouth's Senior Vice President for Community and Campus Life. In this role, she oversees initiatives aimed at enhancing the student experience and fostering a sense of community on campus. Prior to joining Dartmouth, Jennifer held a variety of leadership positions at Barnard College and Georgetown University that focused on diversity initiatives, freedom of expression, and social justice. Sam Levy is the Associate Dean of the Faculty for the Arts and Humanities and a professor of philosophy at Dartmouth. His scholarly work centers on metaphysics and the philosophy of mathematics. He has served as Associate Dean since 2020 and has been closely involved in examining the college's free speech-related policies, notably chairing the Committee on Freedom of Expression and Dissent, whose work and efforts led to some very recent updates to those policies in those areas. And Connor Murnane is the Campus Advocacy Chief of Staff at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, otherwise known as FIRE. He oversees FIRE's higher education initiatives working to protect and promote free speech on college campuses nationwide. Prior to FIRE, Connor was Director of Communications for the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. He has degrees in history and political communications. So please join me welcoming our panelists for what will surely be a thought-provoking discussion. So to start out, maybe just, I provided an introduction that was about roles and places, but I know that many who get involved in free speech issues also have experiences that sometimes have shaped their engagement and the way they think about this. Maybe if each of you could, maybe starting, Connor, with our guest from furthest afield, start with you, and if there's anything that you could share to help us understand what has shaped your point of view on this.
Everyone hear me okay? I don't know if this is picking up. Sounds like it, so I'll go. What got me into this, I was actually PhD track, not philosophy of mathematics, that's a little intimidating, but political philosophy, and I was teaching a class at American University, intro freshman class, actually on free speech on campus. And about 2 weeks in, I had a first semester freshman come to my office hours and say, how could you be such a vocal conservative on this campus? I didn't think I was a vocal conservative. You know, the last political campaign I worked was Rob Portman's Senate campaign in Ohio. At the same time, my wife was on Hillary Clinton's campaign here in New Hampshire, right? That's the kind of household I was in. I would throw in the bomb if a discussion in class was going in a circle, trying to pull out other ideas, get someone to grapple with, you know, a thought they might not have heard. And what kind of shocked me and pushed me out of that PhD track to go work at ACTA and then FIRE was the idea that the student wasn't bothered by hearing that opinion, but he was shocked to hear it at all on American's campus. So he was there 2 weeks, wanted a degree, you know, he was in a program that was spelled out for the next 4 years, didn't even have time for an elective, but he didn't expect he was going to hear a right of center view, and that wasn't an arena I wanted to work in. And I don't think you could truly have a strong college, a strong education without views across the political spectrum, regardless of wherever you stand. So I decided to pump the brakes there, and that was, you know, 8-9 years ago. I don't think I'm going back.
Never say never.
I loved it. Teaching, the 6 months on the job teaching, the best 6 months I've had.
Thanks. Sam?
Yeah, so I came into my work on freedom of expression and dissent here partly in the way that people in administration or in faculty do, having done other things that were related, then getting picked up for that. So about 6 years ago, I was working on a task group that was rewriting our Title IX processes and policies for resolving grievances against faculty, students, or staff under the Title IX rubric. And I was chair of the committee on the faculty, which is often involved in matters that policy that affect faculty, and the Title IX policy certainly affected that. We realized at the time when a template new version of the Title IX policies was coming out that it didn't have everything quite set up correctly, or not the way we thought would be optimal. That pulled me into a very long series of months of working together with our then general counsel, Sandhya Iyer, and her staff, and the other committees on campus that look at this. It also put me in close contact with our Dean of Faculty, Elizabeth Smith, who's overseeing that got my hands in policy writing for Dartmouth. Also ended up putting me in the dean's office, because if your head's up at a certain moment when the dean is looking to fill a certain role, they'll ask you to come and do it. So I ended up in the dean's office, I think, indirectly through that. My exposure into the space of freedom of expression and dissent per se also comes from my background in philosophy, where in our classrooms, contested viewpoints, including very marginalized ones, are handled every single day. The friction of significant disagreement, where you need to be able to step back impartially, look at the evidence, push hard on people's positions with criticisms and objections, and still come out of that on favorable terms with everyone around. That's the normal way, the stock and trade in which philosophy traffics in all of its conversations. That is not always automatically the case, and it takes a lot of sanding of sharp elbows to get used to being in those spaces, and it takes a lot of bravery if you're not used to that kind of style of give and take. When you are trained up in that space, then you see people having trouble feeling free to speak their minds on things, it sets off alarm bells. So it was gravitational attraction for me a little bit, thinking these are problems that could be addressed, where people with a lot of practice in doing versions of this kind of difficult discussion can be helpful. The other part is I'm a child of 2 lawyers, so we spent endless years at the kitchen table debating all these kinds of topics, including constitutional matters and freedom of expression and dissent. So when the Fed policy was going to be revisited about a year ago, right? This is when Provost Dave Coates was asking around to see if we could stand up a committee to continue some work that had already been started at that point. I can tell that story later. I got tapped for that and was very glad to be able to say yes and do it.
Great, thanks. Jennifer?
So my PhD is actually in film and media studies, and so I would say expression has always been kind of an integral part of the work I do, the work I study, and the work I think about. I'd say a major inflection point in this area probably happened for me at my previous institution. I was responsible for our teaching and learning center. And so a few years back, it's all blurry now, but post-COVID, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, faculty were starting to be concerned around their own self-censorship, what they could say in the classroom, how to create engaging dialogue in the classroom, what were the different practices that they could use to create these spaces. And so I started to do a lot of work on that. And so that became an area of focus as I thought about thinking about what that looked like on our campus, who was doing it well, how could we share some of those practices, how could we ensure that these classrooms were brave spaces for this kind of work. And so that eventually led to our current president, Bylock, tasking me and the provost at my previous institution with putting together a faculty committee around academic freedom. And so we were able to do 2 years worth of very thorough work on case studies that were happening at institutions across the country to think about how we wanted to understand academic freedom and freedom of expression on our own campus. And so when I transitioned over here to Dartmouth at the beginning of the fall, I was quickly connected with Sam and others on the campus thinking about what freedom of expression looked like specifically here. And so it has been a very exciting and major part of the work that I have been doing with others this year.
Super. Thanks for the background. And so maybe, Connor, if you could talk a little bit about FIRE. Many are familiar with the organization and the ranking and rating systems, but many may not be. So if you can give us some background, not only on how that works, but maybe a little bit of the history and what it's intended to do.
Okay, FIRE was founded in 1999 by Harvey Silverglate and Alan Charles Kors, who were 2 Princeton roommates of different political persuasions. They ended up writing a book together called The Shadow University, and it was about kind of kangaroo courts, Title IX issues, and just the student disciplinary due process. Due process and the issues with it. When they published that book, they ended up getting kind of buried with requests from students and professors across the country asking for legal support. They started doing it pro bono. They kept doing it pro bono until about 2001, 2002, so 2 or 3 years of this pro bono work before they decided we should actually find an office and hire a staff. So until about 2022, we were just a higher ed organization providing legal support to students and faculty, public and private university campuses. We've never commented on the speech we defend, only its status under the Constitution. For us, it's protected or not, and if speech is protected by the Constitution, we'll defend it. It ends there. It puts us often on both sides of the political spectrum. Just last year, we were down suing against the DeSantis administration's Stop Woke Act in Florida that was trying to ban what they called divisive concepts in the classroom, basically, DEI-like topics. And at the same time we're doing that, we were suing the California community college system because they were mandating faculty pledge their allegiance to a DEI statement for hiring or promotion. So that's just one example. I can point to a dozen more. You name your political topic, we've probably picked up a case on each side. So that's a quick blurb about FIRE, we also, in 2022, we expanded off campus. So we bulked up our litigation arm. We're up to about 35, 36 litigators on staff now. We have probably about 30 cases going in districts and circuit courts across the country. The rankings, which I believe is one of the focal points of this conversation, we started the rankings in 2020, 2021, trying to do 2 things, right? Create a consistent way to kind of measure progress or a decline of student perceptions of free speech on campus, but also give a snapshot view for prospective students and their parents who are trying to choose where to attend. That first year was about 55 colleges. Since then, we've grown it to last year at 251. We're probably going to add 5 or 6 this upcoming year. Last year, we surveyed just over 58,000 students, if I remember correctly. The rankings are composed of 3 main components. One is a student survey. We ask students anywhere from 20 to 30 questions on a number of topics. We assess students' comfort expressing ideas, their likelihood to self-censor, their tolerance for different viewpoints, their support of disruptive conduct to censor speech, whether or not they perceive their administration would be willing to defend their rights if a speech controversy arose, and their openness to engaging with difficult ideas. That is weighted based on anything from national statistics on student populations to the university's own IPEDS data. This is all publicly available. Same thing with our methodology. The second component of the rankings next to the student survey are campus behavioral metrics, so student and scholar sanctions, successful deplatforming attempts, or event disruptions on campus. And on the flip side of that, we also do try, we recognize that running a college is just an inherently kind of controversial endeavor. You're never going to have a quiet semester, nor should you, right? You should feel, intellectually yucky once or twice in your college career. We try to give points, right? So if something happens on campus and a university unequivocally defends, a speaker's rights, or says, we're not going to accept shoutdowns in an event, we give bonus points. I'll give a little sneak peek. We are trying to find more ways to give bonus points. I believe this next year, we're going to look at Chicago statement and institutional neutrality adoptions to give just a few bonus points to encourage good administrative behavior. And then the third category that goes in the rankings is speech codes. For almost Fire's entire existence, we've analyzed speech codes and different expressive activity policies on campuses across the country, around 500 in a given year on a red, yellow, green light scale. Red at a public university would be unconstitutional, yellow is a little too arbitrary, ripe for administrative abuse, and green is good to go. So to give a little sneak peek at Dartmouth from this last year, if anyone doesn't know, I believe Dartmouth came in at, I don't have to believe, I wrote it down, at 224 out of 251, an overall score out of 100 of 34.4. Part of that was a yellow speech code rating, which has been rectified, so that'll automatically pull Dartmouth up. They have a green light now, first Ivy League institution to get a green light from Fire on speech codes too. An indicator for me that something is not right out of the 251 schools on just the administrative support category. So students' perceptions on the administration's kind of willingness to defend speech or have their back, 213 out of 251. And then another factor that pulled them down, 3, event issues or deplatformings. I can go into those a little bit more if there's questions later. But those do decay over time. We have adjusted the methodology and are always working to improve it a bit more proactively, because we ran the numbers and we realized it would take Harvard about 30 years or so to dig out of the hole they dug themselves into. Dartmouth is nowhere near that, but I wouldn't be surprised if, the Corky event I was talking to someone out there about, that'll probably be kind of just decaying off entirely, so that number will drop in this next cycle, which should come out late August, early September.
And maybe, Connor, you talked a little bit about how it should be used, prospective parents, students, and whatnot. Is there anything that you would say it shouldn't be used for, or cautions around how to use the rankings and the ratings?
It's a social science, right? So there's always kind of room for interpretation or error. I'll give you one concrete example. The recent, I guess he's appointed now, director of NIH, Jay Bhattacharya, said, he wants to find some kind of free speech, academic freedom ranking system to help determine how to issue these government grants, and we said, please don't use ours if that's what's going to happen. It is a measure of perception, right? It is students' belief, by and large. Sure, there's the administrative actions and written policy, but student perception can change. We also didn't want, in this specific instance, we didn't want a moderately bright student going, wait a minute, if I disrupt this event, I can drag down the school's college free speech ranking and then possibly jeopardize funding, right? That's group accountability on a scale we didn't want to. So that's one example. If I can pivot a little bit, I'll talk about a limitation on this that I've been talking to administrators across the country on recently. We don't have grad students. We don't have professional students. I don't know what the percentage of those students are here at Dartmouth, but elsewhere, schools like NYU or Fordham, that's such a large percentage of the student population, and it's just really damn hard to survey them. And also faculty aren't factored into this. So if you're looking at it, it really is a snapshot. You're getting a student who's ideally on campus for 4 years to take this survey, and the world could be different 2 or 3 times over by the time they graduate. Being able to identify faculty every year to start getting into the survey would give a more kind of ranking with more longevity. That's why we come out every year. The data we do have is publicly available and can be compared year over year, but we really emphasize kind of just a snapshot. And then if a university administration wants to work towards improvement, we're going to be asking these students these questions every time, so you can kind of see it in the attitudes and things. But that primary purpose is just a snapshot, and then a trying to give an idea of where potential reform might be. It's not necessarily prescriptive in and of itself.
So maybe Sam and Jennifer, you actually have to do things and make changes happen, and certainly have your own sources of information and input. So how would, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you look at, and then to the extent it feels relevant, how you would compare it to something like fire, and maybe where there are gaps or other things that you think maybe you would call out about using a standardized rating system.
You can jump.
Do you want me to start? Yeah, so a couple things. One is when Sam was working on the freedom of expression and dissent policy, and I had just showed up and was kind of charged or tasked with thinking about how do we better support the perception that students here have that freedom of expression, they feel supported here, what do we need to know? And so Sam and I did what we'd like to call a road show. We went to, we had some town halls with students, we did some focus groups. I met with different groups of faculty. I even had a group of students over my house for dinner as we talked about kind of what is the brave space, and is it actually a brave space here at Dartmouth? And so we tried to get as many different perspectives on hearing kind of what were some of the challenges that students felt were here, and how might we try to work through some of those. So those were all, I would say, more qualitative in the work that we were doing here. We have carried out a climate survey that was put together through our ITE office and Gallup. And that went out to all students and then separately to faculty and staff in January. So we are eager to get that data back, I think at the end of June, to have a better sense of where our students, faculty, and staff think about kind of their experience here and where that freedom of expression is.
Okay. How was the response rate on that?
Really good, actually. I want to say at least over 20%, but like a lot higher on the faculty staff
That's awesome.
side.
We've really struggled nationally on faculty response rates, but the minute we focus on one school, like an MIT, for instance, it skyrockets. So I'm always curious to know what it looks like internally.
It's always my first question. Anytime I see survey data, I always scroll to the bottom and see what is the percentage of people that filled it out.
235 Dartmouth undergrads, if you're curious.
Okay.
Sam, anything to?
Yeah, so I'll just add some friendly skepticism. So I'm very skeptical of the use of rankings, not particularly skeptical of the use of ratings. So FIRE is thought of as a tremendous advocate on behalf of their legal analysis and defense team when there are mistreatments of faculty or students or people who are having their rights infringed. FIRE is terrific in coming forward with deft analysis and public statements and statements sent to the relevant authorities inside of the administrations. Then there's the analysis of policy, and I think they're also a very good policy team. Ratings to ask about what's with respect to different types of policies or senses of community or climate, I think also that can be useful, particularly very coarse grain, red, green, yellow, that's fine with me. The rankings piece, not for FIRE in particular, but in many different domains, is something that is bait for people to think a lot about and gets their attention, where it's very rare that ordinal rankings actually, the differences in positions among ordinal rankings corresponds to a well-understood feature of social reality. That's just too much complexity to compact into a single ranking system. I'm familiar with these in many different domains where people are trying to do this. My sense is that it's an important piece of PR to get the attention of different institutions so that FIRE can come in with their goods, which largely in thinking you guys are the good guys coming in with good ideas. The thought that at home potential students or parents are asking where in this particular scale, what relative to these other schools, where exactly does any institution fit, I think that's a fairly significant mistake in trying to understand what the institution is that you're looking at. And I say the same thing in many different domains where there are ratings and rankings, and it creates proxies for individuals to chase or care about and for institutions to chase and care about. I do think it's really important for universities, generally speaking, to be thinking, what are our policies and what's our community state? So doing climate surveys, which are also very hard to do. I mean, the social science tells you is enormously difficult to get good information, and then to translate that into action and reform. I'm all in favor of trying to do something like that. So there's an aspect of this that I think is, for me, concerning about the consumers of a rankings system. And Connor pointed out, well, here's a consumer we would not have wanted, namely federal funding agencies to come in. So there are many ways to misuse data. There's lots of different kinds of surveys and analyses that you can do that can produce different kinds of data points. Then you decide how to scatter those. Do you put them in an ordinal ranking? Do you put them on a plot? Do you put them in multi-dimensional frameworks? Putting them in an ordinal ranking invites lots of ways for people to misinterpret the significance of the information. And I don't mean like it's insignificant, but just what does it mean? What is that telling us? So for me, the ranking system falls into a large bucket of skepticism that I have about many different kinds of ranking systems. That said, I do think it is important for schools to take very seriously whether there's a PR mechanism for making them do that or not. What their policies are, what their protocol is going to be, what kind of community they want to build, and what kind of signal they want to embed in their culture about what kind of expression is promoted, tolerated, supported, and where are the ones where there's bounds. And for any such community that's got inquiry and automatically going to have different points of view, where it's utterly predictable and inevitable that an institution of higher learning, people are going to say things that are going to roil groups or individuals outside of the group that's saying those things. That is par for the course. That is really important to understand. But that doesn't mean that you sit back and say the culture just takes care of itself. You do need to think about cultivating the culture. And rules are not enough, and procedures are not enough. You have to grow a whole community around it. And that part, I think, is endlessly valuable, and we work on it all the time.
Can I make him happy real fast?
Please.
Because I share similar concerns with rankings, right? There has to be a first, there has to be last. If you're doing a ranking, if you look at ours, I believe UVA's first. UVA's first was like a 76. In my house growing up, that was a failure. So we should have the new ranking methodology public in the next couple weeks, maybe months. We're looking at, don't quote me on this because I don't think it's been finalized, just doing letter grades instead, right? You may be number one in the letter grade, but that doesn't mean there's not improvement until you have an A+. Which I think will more accurately paint a picture.
Yeah.
You all mentioned at some level the challenges of getting survey responses in order to get the feedback. Could you just talk about how accurate, how good is it? Is it good enough? You'll always be trying to make it better, but maybe just starting with Jennifer and Sam, do you feel pretty good about the information that you've got? And then maybe Connor, how you think about what the threshold is before this is really valid or useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, in previous, before being a director of teaching in the Learning Center, I was a director of research and evaluation. So I think a lot about surveys, collecting this information, and I think one of the challenges is always what is the motivation and who is willing to fill it out based off of what it is that is being asked, and how might that change the information that you're getting. And so I think, like Connor and I were saying, a reading practice is always to look at the percentage of people that the respondents that filled it out, how it was filled, right? Like, so is it phone calls, and who has a phone versus a cell phone? Is it in the mail, and who actually reads that mail and puts it in? So thinking about the methodology, I think, is really important. Thinking about the motivation to fill it out, and ensuring that it comes from folks that you might trust, or open that email, or fill out that survey. And so I think trying to find those ways it's a bigger challenge. It's one we talk about all the time at the institutional level. How do we ensure that our students don't have survey fatigue by just trying to do one climate survey that touches on all the different climate pieces, and then how can people pull from that? So I think it is a very challenging thing to think about. But I do think what these surveys often do is they provide us with questions that we can investigate further, or help us understand better what it is that we don't know, or what these trends might be that we want to know a little more about. And so I think, I always think, you could do it both ways. One is you start with the qualitative, and it helps you make a really good quantitative survey, or you start with a quantitative survey that starts to ask questions, and you need to dig deeper by doing focus groups and engaging with students. And so I think this work is super super important. I think it's really challenging, but I do think it's the key at the end of the day is to get community input. So let's know what our students are thinking. Let's know what our faculty are thinking. Let's know what our staff are thinking, and let's ensure that we are making together, creating that culture where we all feel like we have that academic freedom and freedom of expression to thrive.
Anything else, Sam, or Connor?
Yeah, I would just say similarly, having been in the dean's group where there are always social scientists among the deans, anytime we want to ask about a survey or interpreting a survey, the social science deans come in and read it and say, this survey was poorly constructed. And I trust them. It's incredibly hard. There's both the selection effects and which people are going to respond, and then there's the framing effects of how the questions are put and what kinds of answers and what scales the answers are on. Every piece of that is so delicate. So I really leave it to the pros. Our incoming Dean of Faculties this summer, John Carey, is a specialist in surveys, among other things. So I always would defer to John, ask, is this survey going to be something as a useful tool for us? I also largely agree with Jennifer's take that when you get a survey, knowing the limitations, it's the start of an analysis. It is not a conclusion that you draw. It's an indicator. You wonder why certain kinds of questions have answers aggregated in certain places, and it tees up for you some opportunities to formulate hypotheses about what might be going on and where you can dig further and start to get in more substantial informational spaces to find out. Survey doesn't tell you the answers to questions. It tells you a little bit of the landscape of where you can go more productively, have further inquiry.
Absolutely. I guess, bluntly answer your question, we wouldn't put it out there if we weren't confident in the statistical significance in some capacity. And, College Pulse is our survey partner. If you are an outside organization trying to survey, college students and you don't have access to someone who's going to let Gallup in the door, they're probably the best in the business. They do a two-stage verification to confirm you're a student. When we were shopping around for a survey firm to survey students and to build out these panels, we had one firm say, we just see if there's a .edu email. And another said, well, they just have to check this box that they're a student, and we immediately ran away from that. So we're pretty confident that we're hitting the right audience now. There is, any number of selection biases. We're sending it to whatever their panel is at Dartmouth, so we're hoping as many as possible, open it up and choose. But they're still incentivized. College Pulse gives them like little brownie points to spend at the College Pulse store, maybe even on Dartmouth's campus. I don't know the specifics.
And maybe for Sam and Jennifer, Connor talked about how FIRE is working to get more input from faculty and grad students as well. Is there much of a trade-off, or could you just comment on whether at Dartmouth students or faculty see things very differently, and if there's much balancing that you have to do for those two different groups?
You can start this time.
Yeah, so I think there are many different subgroups, and faculty students is one particular place to see a difference in communities, but even subcommunities among the faculty will interpret what's going on the ground very differently. When you're in the dean's office, you see a lot of different groups responding to a lot of different information, where on the inside you know more firsthand what's going on. On the outside, there's a lot more guessing. And you watch the interpretation of actions land and sort of the projection, reasonable ones, about what's going on in the mind of people who are taking steps or formulating policy, and you realize it is very hard to have your intentions and communications land the way you were hoping that they would. And even to catch up afterwards and say, no, this is what we meant. And have people say, that's not what you meant. It is definitely the case that faculty respond differently than administrators, and that students respond differently from faculty, and students in certain subgroups respond very differently from one another. Sometimes the subgroups, the affinity groups, spread more powerfully across students and faculty together than the distinction between faculty and students or between admin and faculty. It's constantly a question for us whether we are hearing from the right groups of people so that we know we've got their input, we have their point of view. It's also constantly a question of whether the signals that we're sending are the ones that are being received. That is, there's nothing sort of special about survey methods, but for any matter of community concern where there's a widespread sort of nebulous question that you're trying to get at, always a concern trying to make sure you've got the best information, that people are also responding and understanding what your moves are in response on that. And questions about speech and freedom of speech are as fraught as they can be when times are tough.
Yeah, I would just add to a very small, there's also academic freedom and freedom of speech and that, and expression, and so that looks very different too. And so the privileges, the responsibilities that go with those two can be very different for faculty, staff, and graduate students, and rankings within those areas as well.
So Jennifer, just for some who may not think as deeply about this as you do, how would you describe the difference between academic freedom and freedom?
Do you have
Sorry if I
4 hours?
The thumbnail.
So academic freedom comes with, and feel free to either of you to jump in, but academic freedom comes with a faculty's expertise. And so to be a professor at this at Dartmouth, for example, you have academic freedom. So you have control over the content of your research, of your scholarship, of your teaching, and you work within a field that helps assert that control and provides a review of that research and your expertise. And so that is the way in which that takes place. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression comes from our First Amendment. We are a private institution, but we create our own policies around what that freedom of speech looks like, knowing that having freedom of speech on a campus helps us get at better ideas, better discoveries, helps us pursue knowledge in those ways that are really important. And so our students have freedom of speech here on campus, as do our faculty. And Sam can go a little bit more into this, I think, because of the Fed policy and where faculty may have more control over certain things like the content of their classroom.
Yeah, so great, rich topic. I don't want to hold forth on it too long.
It's a whole hour panel.
Yeah. But just sort of very briefly, it is true that as a private institution, if we're going to provide speech protections, that's something we do not as a matter of legal requirement, but as something we want to stand up on behalf of our own community. You know, the constitutional protections that we have restrain the federal government and state governments from infringing on individual speech in certain contexts. We're a private institution. We're not an arm of the federal government or a state government, unlike the case for public universities, which are. Most private universities want to have some domain that's very similar to the kinds of protections that are afforded to citizens by the federal governments and states. Here we've stood up a policy which is very common, very closely tracks First Amendment, extended through 14th Amendment kind of protections for speech. It's never going to be identical, but it's going to be close. And one of the changes that we made in our policy here was to intentionally move closer to a framework of speech that is controlled under the First Amendment interpretation. So roughly speaking, actually, I'll briefly tell you a story. Jennifer's heard the story before, and so has Ed. So Dartmouth's freedom of expression and dissent policy came up in 1967 during the Vietnam War. And it was a response to what's called Hershey's directive. So Louis Hershey, who was the head of the Selective Service, was trying to stamp out various kinds of interference from anti-war protesters with the Selective Service actions on campus, and issued this directive that said that students who had draft deferments but were engaged in anti-war protests of certain kinds would automatically, immediately have their deferment status revoked and be eligible for immediate induction into military service. That, of course, provoked a firestorm across campuses. Dartmouth, like many, responded by trying to find protections that they could afford to students on campus for that. What they put together was a sort of locus protections that said, we are going to protect all kinds of protest and dissent. That's why our policy is called freedom of expression and dissent, was the right to dissent was front and center for that. And had responsibility for the students too, not just any kind of speech is automatically protected. And they went in a mode that was similar to, but not quite perfectly tracking what First Amendment protections looked like at the time. It also required recruiters, so military recruiters on campus, to sign an agreement when they arrived saying that they recognized the freedom to dissent held by students at Dartmouth's campus, which gave a bit of a shield to students. They could speak out in the way they wanted to on campus, and that could not count as activity that was prohibited on campus. Couldn't trigger Hershey's directive to have their draft deferments revoked. they were very thoughtful in the way they put this policy together. It stood almost unchanged up until this year, and we've only changed some of the pieces around it. Parallel matter was happening through the Supreme Court. So there's the O'Brien case, which is also an anti-war protest case where O'Brien burned a draft card and then was punished for this and protested his punishment by claiming there was a freedom of speech protection that had been violated along with this public act. The Supreme Court decided in that case, no, it wasn't protected speech, but articulated a framework around which the state would have to observe what its protections were. And that has more or less been the framework that exists now, where the most important controlling precedent since then is the 1989 Ward case, where the framework is that the government can limit speech on behalf of the citizens only in a sort of narrow set of circumstances. First, its actions in limiting speech have to be content neutral. Can't limit speech on the basis of what it is saying, and it has to be serving a substantial government interest, and it has to do so in sort of the least intrusive way, or at least not excessively and substantially over what's required to do that, and it has to be able to provide a channel for expression of the same message somewhere else, so you can sort of get an ample channel for similar expression. The rough framework of that was already in place in 1968 O'Brien decision, but it's being refined over time till now. So what happened at Dartmouth and what happened at the O'Brien decision took slightly different paths through time. And here we are 60 years later, and my group not my group, the group I was chairing, when we were looking at this, we thought the Supreme Court has done a slightly better job of tailoring speech protections over time than what we have sort of frozen in amber from 1967. So we've decided very self-consciously to adopt some of the key principles of Supreme Court precedent on that, so that our policies now look closer to First Amendment protections than they did before. There's a big key difference, and this will be true at almost any institution of higher learning that's got a policy of its own. Speech protections under constitutional law protect individuals against actions by the state. They do not protect individuals from actions by other private individuals. It is not against First Amendment protections for me to shout Connor down. I'm not an actor on behalf of the state. At many institutions of higher ed, including here, we have a reciprocity principle that students need to respect the opportunity for free expression of other students on campus. So our restraint policy here primarily restrains the administration. The administration cannot come in and take control of student speech except in limited circumstances. But it's also the case that students have to respect that for one another. So that has an implication that First Amendment protections don't have, like an anti-heckling implication. If Connor's, as a free citizen standing on the street speaking out on something and I heckle, there's no protection for him under the First Amendment because I'm not an officer of the state. If he's a student on campus or engaged in a certain classroom activity and I'm heckling and I'm a student, there's a protection against that. So they're never going to line up exactly. It's a slightly different context, but it is one that we care very much about. It also helps that First Amendment's got great campaign and public awareness around it over many years, and people understand that pretty well. And it's helpful when you're a private institution trying to stand up your own rules to think, here's a sensible, well-understood, well-oiled machine for protecting speech. We could adopt its principles and people will natively understand it pretty well.
Maybe that's a good jumping off point for talking about at Dartmouth. There's a big focus on building skills. And so, Sam, you talked about the principle of reciprocity and respect, but turning that into behaviors and a culture takes more. So maybe Jennifer and Sam, could you talk a little bit about what's happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Dartmouth, we have Dartmouth Dialogues, which is both a way for students to learn the skills to dialogue as well as to watch and model dialogue happening across difference. And so last year, the Middle East Dialogues were, I think, pretty well renowned nationally as a great example of being able to talk across difference. Some of the skills work that's happened out of Dean Smith's office with our executive director, Christy Clemens, they did skills-based training through orientation for all the 28s this year in orientation. They will do another round of it actually the sophomore summer to see where they're at as well, and to really be able to kind of follow this through. There are smaller ways for this to take place. So a good example is they have a StoryCorps where a student can come together with a student who might be different than them, or an administrator that might be different than them, and have a facilitated conversation and to learn through those skills. So I did one of those. I had a really wonderful facilitated conversation with a student here at Dartmouth, and we still check in after that conversation. And so thinking about where are those spaces in which we can break down some of those structures. It also happens in our classrooms. Our teachers, our professors are experts in being able to create the seminar space to engage across difference, and then it's student-led. So DPU here on this campus is incredible and really does an amazing job bringing in speakers, hosting and facilitating conversations for folks that see things differently. And then I would add, on all of these layers, that while this work takes place here and we really foster it, we also are really big about the relationship, creating relationships, creating trust, having those spaces and being able to model that. So one of the examples I love to give is our Chabad Rabbi Moshe once a term does bring your friend to Shabbat dinner. And so the idea is that our students get to show pride in their Jewish identity, to bring folks who aren't necessarily Jewish or who don't necessarily have Shabbat dinner at the Chabad, and to learn and to appreciate. And so I think this is something that's gone on for years. So these kinds of structures that are part of kind of the Dartmouth experience. I also love to say that Moshe says that our Muslim chaplain Abdul saved Hanukkah 2 years ago because his lighter wasn't frozen and actually worked. And so these kinds of things, I think, help kind of demonstrate for our larger community the importance of relationship building, that you can engage in conversation across difference, and that we support it. So I would say there's some of that skill building, and then some of it is just facilitating the spaces that this can happen and to reassure those spaces can happen here. So one of the things we learned from our students in Sam and my roadshow was 8 days for a permit to host a protest makes absolutely no sense. Protests, demonstrations, vigils, they're responding to the moment. There are things that are happening and they need to be able to do them now. So I worked really closely with our town manager and figured out how is it that we could create an exception. So sure, the conference, the concert on the green may take 8 days for the town to be able to support something like that. But a protest, a demonstration, a vigil, how can we switch that up and so it happens faster? So this year we were able to get a 2-day permit put into practice here on this campus. We also have support systems and the expertise on this campus. And so one of the things I was really excited about when I got here is my colleague Ed McKenna here was running a program in student life where he was training different administrators throughout the campus on de-escalation techniques to be there for events. So if we were bringing speakers in, there would be an administrator for students to have a kind of support system. This was someone that knew how to de-escalate if there might be heckling or things that would disrupt an event. And so I was like, well, this is amazing. We actually have something on this campus that helps ensure that something like deplatforming doesn't happen. How do we scale that up? How do we ensure our whole campus has access to something like that? And so Ed has been doing an incredible job doing trainings and workshops with colleagues in our different professional and graduate schools, as well as growing that program so that not just our undergrad student organizations, but folks that bring people on campus do have that support, and so that these events can and will take place.
I'm very excited to see the data from Dartmouth next year in our rankings. We saw a little bit last year from Vanderbilt, who has a similar dialogue program, put a ton of resources and energy. We ask about 10 different topics, do you struggle to talk about these things? On every single one of those topics, but Israel-Palestine, they saw like almost a 10-point jump.
Oh, wow.
And so I've now been out there recommending Vanderbilt's program and Dartmouth's program whenever I'm on the campus. So I hope your school backs me up with the data soon.
I do too.
Which we'll know when.
Late August, early September.
And are surveys out now? Or
Yeah,
when?
we survey in the second semester. We want freshmen to have a few months on campus to kind of get up to speed. And we will do it from about January 1 to mid to end of May, when there's a relevant story going on campus, when the encampments were all over the place. We actually were able to kind of push the survey a little bit longer and a little bit harder. So we didn't factor encampments into the rankings that year,
Right.
but we were able to look at student perceptions pre and post encampment and administrative action, and basically say, if you did something like option A here, your students are going to have a lot more faith in you to handle the next one compared to option B, which was very interesting. We're considering, I don't know if it is, I should have done my homework, Harvard, pre and post lawsuit, Columbia, pre and post kind of Trump demand letter to see if there's any kind of reverberations on campus.
So maybe focusing on the now, one of the things that is interesting is that free speech has been a topic of concern for years, decades. But historically, those concerns seem to have come out of more of the right or the right of a more centrist political viewpoint. Now, there are much louder concerns that seem to be coming out of the left. And so the question for anyone who has thoughts, free speech is a label attached to all these concerns, but are they about the same thing or are they about different things? And can you address all of it, or are there inevitably some trade-offs? Sam, you talked about how some things just land differently with different groups. I wonder if you could reflect on that.
I can take an
Yeah.
early stab. Free speech has been and always will be a tool of the minority. The minute you have 51% of the vote, 51 people to 49, you have the manpower. You don't need speech, you don't need persuasion anymore. So for a long time in the campus context, conservatives were in the minority in the student population and the faculty and the administration. And FIRE used to joke, we had a marriage of convenience with conservatives. We probably have defended more Turning Point USA chapters than, students for Socialist America or whatever, pick your left-leaning student group. Where since the expansion, in a number of, redder states, we found, things like the Stop Woke Act in Florida popping up, redder local governments, trampling on pride parades, trying to, you talking about speeding up a permit. We've seen attempts to slow down a permit based on community behavior standards. Well, who gets to determine what that behavior is? The four of us up here voting, right? That's not a very good democratic process. So with that in mind, the script has been flipped almost. We now have a Republican administration who's coming pretty aggressively at what has been an issue on campus. Is that due to double standards in how colleges have governed themselves? Or is a speech infringement on one population carried out the same way on another? I don't know. It varies campus to campus. But whatever kind of issue was seen by one side of the aisle, I think that the attempt at retribution is now coming. And how do you address that? I don't know if there's a silver bullet. I think you've heard how many different answers for addressing that culture from a policy standpoint too. Up here, all I know is that without a kind of baseline understanding of what is and isn't kind of acceptable, whether under First Amendment law or the cultural side of free speech, I don't think you can even stumble into an answer.
Yeah, we're a heterogeneous community, so questions about free speech and what it means and what its implementation means will be very differently answered in different places. I tend myself to be, like most people trained in the, grown in the American system, things, free speech is this incredibly powerful, extremely broad, right? Not absolutely unfettered, but super strong, which requires us to embrace a lot of pretty painful activity on the part of our fellow citizens or community members. That's not universally the view of free speech across the world. United States is a standout, not because we respect free speech, but because we've got a close to absolutist view of it. Most of the rest of the world has much more mild protections for speech because they have concerns about some of the downstream consequences of speech that we are willing to say we have to absorb those consequences because the degree of freedom we want is so important. Other countries have put the balance point in different places. One of the things, so my own intuitions on this are very much sort of traditional, super First Amendment protective instincts. Like that's where my intuitions are on this, and we've built our campus policies to reflect that, and not because they're mine, but that's because we're Americans. We tend to build things this way. There are important caveats, and it is hard to take these on board and figure out a sort of universal policy for them, but they are community matters. Not everyone has the same kind of cultural access to conversations to feel free to take advantage of the right to speak. And that is not something that's easy to write into policy. It is also just true that speech can harm people even where it is not illegal and even where it is not prohibited. But there are a couple of big, broad categories of speech that are already against the law federally or mandated by or against state laws or against local laws or are mandated by the federal government for universities to rule out. So harassment, discrimination, retaliation, coercion, things like that. But we know from the science of this by people who are experts on free speech that there's lots of speech that sits inside of those categories that has the same kind of physiological effect on the recipients of difficult speech that physical violence can have. So we live in a world where we are making a choice about where we're going to put the line on protected activity, and we put it pretty far over in the United States. But when you're having a realistic view of actually what's the biological landing of a lot of kinds of behavior, speech can be enormously negatively powerful for people. And this is not because people are fragile and snowflakes. We just can track blood cortisol levels and see what happens. And it's just one of the things that we haven't, I think, embraced fully and taken on board fully. So there's a whole space to push back about how strong our free speech protections could be, which we haven't taken on board here. Culturally, that's not where we are in this country. On the other part I mentioned before is there's a real question about having access, lots of ways to have access to spaces to actually be empowered to speak your mind. And it's not as simple as there's a rule that says other people can't shut you up. Those are all matters of cultural development, not policy development, the way we have set up our norms. So speech codes the pendulum swings back and forth between speech codes, which are more restrictive than First Amendment protection, right? We're in an era now where the speech codes came and there's a big crest of those in the 80s, 90s, and then they've sort of subsided again. But they were trying to do something good, and it's very hard to replace that stuff. I think our experiment nationally is that the speech code policy approach wasn't a success. But the things that we were trying to achieve with that really matter. And finding good cultural solutions for that is not easy to do.
Any other thoughts, or we can?
No, I think that was,
Okay.
well, yeah.
So why don't we do a couple questions, and then I'll just, we do have a mic, I was wondering.
Connor, I assume you've read The Coddling of the American Mind,
You assume
and
correct.
in particular the section on cortisol limits, elevated cortisol from hate speech, and how that was used to censor speech within that context of the book. So I wonder if you could comment on what Sam just said. It's a controversial topic. I lean towards sharing the views expressed in The Coddling of the American Mind. And that's a slippery slope that I find troubling, honestly. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
So I'm not going to touch the science, mostly because that's how I get in trouble.
Yeah.
But I'll actually give you a little story here. Greg Lukianoff, Fire's president and CEO, who wrote Coddling of the American Mind with Jonathan Haidt, originally didn't want to call it Coddling of the American Mind. He lost that fight when he pitched the original article to The Atlantic, and they ran with it, right? So now he feels like he's stuck with blank the American mind. He actually wanted to call it disempowered. He wanted to write, if you read the book, I think you've gotten this, but he wanted to write about how the effort to use speech codes to protect students from words that some claim caused them harm, was actually preventing them from actually, growing enough and being able to engage with those ideas so they didn't carry it and feel like they were physically harmed, but instead they could go into corporate America, go into the boardroom, go out with their friends and engage on a level that wasn't, their person being attacked, but engage with ideas and speech. So I guess that kind of answers your question about getting into the science. Are you looking skeptical?
I find it a slippery slope. What one person might find offensive,
Oh, that's, yeah.
versus what someone else might find offensive, and that's how we got to this. The depths of cancel culture was this concept of, I don't like what you're saying, and it's causing me physical harm.
So we need to suppress it. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so I find it troubling to suggest that, that free speech leads to cortisol elevated, which leads to physical harm. That was a slippery slope that got us into the depths of cancel culture.
I'm old enough to remember, walking around, on the playground as a kid saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." I am also now old enough where I have friends whose, kids are in that age range, and they're not saying these things. So I think it is a cultural problem where, we were kind of built up with that mentality of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words aren't going to hurt me. That's gone. That came with the kind of rise of speech codes. I think that's fair to say. There's reasonable people can disagree, and I think we do, on whether or not the kind of good attempt there is valuable or not. But I agree entirely. To answer your question.
I would just add, too, that I think, regardless of what it is that speech is, I like to think about like the actual pedagogical practices. So what are the structures that we as educators have to create for that speech to be heard, to be understood, and for that knowledge to be gained? Because there are ways in which that gets shut out. And so what might be the framing? What might be the way in which you situate a class? What might be the way in which you situate that dialogue? How might that help create the space for that knowledge to be heard, to be learned, and to be questioned? And so I think it's really important that we think about this not just as an open forum for anyone to say anything, but to think about those invisible or those very visible structures that have to be put in place for that to actually happen. And so I think oftentimes those are the parts that we don't talk about or are not necessarily seen that are crucial, and I would just add that to it.
So I appreciate the discussion on the limitations of surveys, but at the end of the day, lots of folks want to know, is there a climate for free speech at Dartmouth? And whether it's a prospective parent or student or a prospective faculty hiring. So does Dartmouth have a better climate for free speech than Harvard?
Than Harvard? Hell yeah. Sorry.
How do you know that?
Yeah.
How do you know that? And I'd like to hear the Dartmouth folks chime in on that as well.
You guys want to take it? I could also, give some more examples. But yes, much better than Harvard, frankly.
I think we're working really hard to create that. I think, Sam, myself, Ed, and many colleagues on this campus are working really hard to make this the place to do it.
My question was, does Harvard have a better climate than Harvard?
I don't know, I'm not at Harvard.
I'm serious. You don't believe it does?
But in fairness, it'd be hard to know not being at Dartmouth.
Yes.
So
don't have-
in terms of having the, I'm sorry, Lex, what?
Does Dartmouth have a better climate than Barnard?
I'm amazed that you won't take a stand on this.
I think, I'll tell you my reluctance on this. They make assumptions about knowledge I don't have. I mean, people make incredible assumptions about what's happening in other domains, and it is it's really hard, even when you're trying to do good social science work and try to find out, it is really genuinely hard to know what's going on at different campuses. I've taught at Harvard, I had a year down there, I taught up here. My experience is that they were indistinguishable. So when Harvard got trotted out as this place where somehow free speech was incredibly under threat, that did not at all chime with my experience of the place. My experience there was very similar to my experience here. People are very open, students were ready to have difficult conversations, and faculty were ready to say what they thought. And faculty invited students in, and students invited each other into challenging conversations, which has largely been my experience across American higher ed. I do think that it's fair to be asking, is speech culture going to be constructive and open and engaging for the people who are parts of it? I suspect that there's a fairly strong cultural meme right now that free speech is incredibly suffering across higher ed, where I think it's probably not really in such bad shape. I think probably there are anecdotes which catch people's attention and get a lot of viewers and audience members of certain kinds of information streams pretty riled. But the truth on the ground is that, largely speaking, American higher ed is a place that there's incredible foment and support for people to have different points of view on very challenging subjects. It is true that, like in any community, communities over time can drift into natural sense of in-group orthodoxies, even for large groups. And for folks who are not on the inside of a certain group, they might feel like access in there is going to be challenging and they might not feel welcome. And that's going to drift all over the place. I don't generally think that there's a major threat to the general protection of free speech across university campuses. I think there are things that we see where students and faculty and administrators and staff can struggle with having conversations about some very charged topics. How uniform or not that is across campuses, it's hard to say. But to ask blankly, how do we compare to Harvard? How do we compare to Barnard? How do we compare to Reed? How do we compare to Portland State? You really need to have knowledge to weigh in on that. And I'm quite trying to have like a lot of epistemic humility about what do I really know. My experience does not indicate to me that these schools that are sometimes held up as places where free speech is in incredible jeopardy really deserve the reputation, and that they are so different across colleges.
And, go
Can I
ahead.
ask a question then? Because I work with fire, obviously. I care about free speech. I think there's an issue that needs to be solved, but I'm not the one that is going to run around, the sky is falling for free speech. But to say there's not really an issue throws me off, right? So I could go pull up the data for Harvard, but I grabbed a few points from Dartmouth because I'm here at Dartmouth, right? So just last year, 59% of Dartmouth students say that shouting down a speaker to prevent them from speaking is at least sometimes acceptable. And 26% say that using violence to stop speech is sometimes acceptable. In a free country governed by the norms that you talked about and you sold me on a few minutes ago, that should be unacceptable. And if a quarter of the student body on one campus has those thoughts, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but that's a serious problem.
So what I want to know is, what are the control groups where we've had surveys of communities where we think they're performing in an ideal way, and then how do they respond to surveys? And I don't know that we're in the position to make an interpretation based on what this information is about, what the actual norms on the ground are. Here's where I think it's really important. We got really hard information we can look at. What are the policies? And what are the disciplinary actions? What are the steps that have been taken? Because that stuff is very straightforward. It is so hard to get at what the actual day-to-day experience is of any given student. Responding to a survey is some information, but are they really feeling as though in their regular interactions with students on campus or in their classrooms that they are going to maybe need to come to physical violence to stop a speech? Or is this just like an imaginary thought they can have in the limit case? There's a lot of distinctions between people on what they can imagine in a limit case doing, where those limit cases aren't part of their actual lived experience. Those kinds of disagreements, I think, are of some interest to see where people's dispositions are, but that doesn't tell you necessarily what their current real day-to-day experience is. So just for example, my wife and I have this tiny remote difference on where capital punishment might be permissible. We both think in the actual world it's not. But there are possible worlds where things are severe enough, and we disagree about like how far from actuality do you have to go before we would say, yeah, it would be permissible in that case. I have a sense that the willingness of people to say we would resort to violence to respond to speech probably is a little bit of a fantasy dimension about where they would be responding. The fact that they have those differences in what they're willing to say might tell you something, but does that tell you that their actual speech culture is something that we should be worried about? I'm not really convinced of that, but if we had good control cases, here's a community we think is ideal in their actual behavior, and then we ask them to respond on survey questions to provocative circumstances, would that really be different from a community that we could identify based on their actual conduct as, this is one where things are really in trouble, and then see? And I don't yet know that we've got that kind of differential information.
And I would just say in a couple examples of things that have taken place here that I've really appreciated, we've had multiple vigils that have taken place on this campus, and for the most part, from my perspective, because I do think I've gone to most of them, they're respectful. Nobody is shouting down those vigils from a different point of view, and I think that's beautiful. There may be one vigil one night and a different one the next night, but people are respectful of that space, and I think that that's really important. You want to talk about our anonymous online fizz culture, that might look very different. And so I do think what it means to speak when your name is attached to something and what it means to speak anonymously is a whole other category for a whole other day. But those are areas where I definitely think we could think about strengthening and thinking about as a culture and a community.
So maybe, we're pretty much at time, so we'll try to wrap up, but maybe we could segue into just some closing thoughts. And one of my reactions to the question about Harvard and Barnard is, Jennifer, you might be able to answer the question of comparing to Barnard 3 years ago, but everything has changed. And so thinking about everything has changed, maybe if we could just go through general reflections on maybe the overall state of free speech or free speech at Dartmouth, what do the trends feel like to each of you?
Yeah, and I mean, I would start from where I started, which is just, it's been an incredible experience here. I'm so impressed with all the thoughtfulness. We had, for example, we had Mike Pence come to town in November, or I think it was Halloween, it was October 31st. He spoke. There were folks that wanted to go and listen to him because they questioned him. There were folks that wanted to listen to him because they supported him. There were folks that were just curious because he was a vice president. All those people got to go in, they got to hear it, they got to listen, they got to make their own assessments of that. Meanwhile, there were students that wanted to protest that he had a space here, and they protested, and they had the space to protest outside that did not cancel the event, did not cancel the speech, but they were heard, and they had their voices heard. And so we helped, create the structures that all of that could coexist. And so those are the things that I hope to continue to see on our campus. The respect and support of different speech, very important. Continuing to work on what those structures might need to look like, what the rights and the responsibilities of our community need to look like, incredibly important. The dialogue and skill building, so important. The modeling of that, us as the adults in the room, like how do we model that? How do we have those conversations? And then, like I said, the thing that keeps me up at night is the anonymous social media spaces that we don't have control over, we don't have policy on, but that definitely affect our community culture, and thinking about what might be a way to think about that. So those are the things that I think about, and I just cannot emphasize enough how excited I am to be here and to do the work with all the folks that are here.
Sam?
Yeah, I would want to build on that. In-person, face-to-face, real-life, real-time conversation is the best place to build and where people are in their best position to be the best versions of themselves. I think the distinction we've got between real life and online conversation has been very hard for people to absorb. There are all kinds of gestures and indications and reference markers in people's behavior which require practice to be good at being able to talk across difference and being good to be able to give your point of view when you are uncomfortable doing so and hear someone else's point of view when it makes you uncomfortable doing so. When there are not the kind of regular thorn breaks of in-person interaction, a lot of behavior can kind of become crazy seeming. And that is also something that people can practice without knowing it. I think our culture has become degraded a little bit because of that distinction between real spaces and online spaces. I think institutions of higher learning where primarily we've got lots of in-person interaction and it's an incredible boiling pot filled with different points of view over sometimes congenial, sometimes very difficult conversations is a great place for people to build these skills. And the more time we can have with each other together where we have a powerful community of mutual respect and hear that out, the better and more resilient citizens that we'll build. I mean, my view about what higher education is for is building better citizens to make a better society. It gives lots of people opportunities to have skills, to be able to go on and contribute productively and creatively and find the world the way, in the places they want to find it, to make it a better world too, but also to create a society of the kind that we want. This is not particularly about social promotion. I think of this as the giant experiment in making the society a better place. And being in person and being able to talk about difficult subjects with reasonable rules of the road they're very low-lying, right? Very low-lying ones. That's the place you really want people to be able to practice, because those skills are only going to get tested more and more out in the world.
I want to talk more about the anonymous speech stuff, but we don't have time. Look, I'm a born and raised pessimist. For the past couple of years, I was looking a bit more optimistic. You know, we saw the tragedy that was October 7th, and kind of the public woke up. I think college campuses woke up to an actual speech problem on campus, and they're beginning to address it. And then, you know, we've talked about the pendulum a few times up here. The pendulum swung back, and fire just got beat up in the middle. But now we go from a college campus problem, where there are legitimate problems, we can debate whether or not the data tells us there are, to now a federal government that wants to trample speech it doesn't like, and you have colleges and universities either over-complying or pre-complying with any number of demands. I look at a school like Dartmouth as an example. I think the cultural solutions coming out of you know, your programs, your departments, the administrative program that I've definitely linked to dozens of times in various correspondence, because I think it's just so good, are going to be the first stepping stone to creating an actual foundation for a culture that respects free speech. Because, you know, pick your issue, whether it's, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or name it. All of these issues are coming down from a culture. Whether it's the culture that speech codes created, I don't know. But until we create that kind of firm respect for, you know, speech, respect for your fellow man, and just, you know, this kind of true marketplace of ideas mentality, we're never going to, you know, get anywhere. So I can't wait to see the next couple of years at Dartmouth. And I say that as someone who, you know, has probably grumbled about Dartmouth once or twice.
All right, well, thank you. We'll have to wrap it up. We'll have more to talk about the next time we can get everyone together, but I want to thank our panelists for a really good discussion, so really appreciate it.
Putting this together.